I still remember the way the air seemed to thicken around me that morning, the way the smallest details suddenly felt sharp and out of place, like a world rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. I had woken up next to the man I thought I knew better than anyone else, the man I trusted enough to imagine a future with, to plan a wedding with, to whisper promises in the dark when we believed no one else could hear. His voice had always carried a strange kind of gravity to me, soothing and convincing, the type that could make me doubt my own instincts if he spoke firmly enough. And it was that same voice I heard later that day, echoing through the corridors of the police station, speaking with calm authority as if he were merely recounting facts. But they weren't facts. They were lies, deliberate and precise, stitched together into a narrative designed to crush me. It happened so fast, the way it always does when life turns into a nightmare. One moment I was driving to meet him for lunch. The next, I was being asked to step out of my car by two officers who looked at me as if they already knew what I had done. They didn't explain at first, only placed cold steel around my wrists and told me to come quietly. My body obeyed because my mind was paralyzed, trying to connect dots that refused to form a picture. In the back of the squad car, I caught my reflection in the window. Wide eyes, trembling lips, the face of someone who couldn't decide if she was dreaming or already dead. The charges were read to me slowly, almost ceremoniously, as if the words themselves carried the power to destroy the life I had built. Fraud, embezzlement, a list of financial crimes so absurd I could barely understand how my name had been attached to them. But then I heard his name, my fiancé, the one who had come forward, the one who had testified, the one who had handed over evidence meticulously prepared. He had presented himself as the dutiful man caught in the web of his dishonest fiancée, bravely doing the right thing by turning her in. And when I finally saw him at the station, standing just behind the glass with his arms folded, his lips curled into the cruelest smile I had ever seen, he mouthed words that hit me harder than the accusations themselves. "Enjoy prison, love." The soundless cruelty of that sentence dug itself into my chest and lodged there, pulsing with each heartbeat. I wanted to scream, to ask why, to tear down the wall of glass between us and demand answers. But my throat was dry, my voice gone, and all I could do was let the officers push me forward, their hands guiding me deeper into a place I didn't belong. It was surreal how the world seemed to accept his version of me without hesitation, how quickly they categorized me as guilty simply because his lies had been dressed in the right paperwork, the right signatures, the right timing. He had planned this. That was the part that sickened me most in those first hours. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was an execution of character, carried out by the man I had let into every corner of my life. The cell was small, colder than I imagined, with peeling paint and a smell of dampness that seemed to seep into my clothes. I sat there replaying every memory, every moment with him, looking for signs I had missed. The way he had asked strange questions about my bank account, the way he insisted on handling certain documents, the occasional slip of condescension that I brushed off as stress. All of it began to rearrange itself into a map of betrayal. He had been building this case against me silently while still kissing me goodnight, while still calling me his future wife. And now I was here, stripped of dignity, labeled as something vile, because he had decided my destruction was more valuable to him than my love. The worst part wasn't the cell or the stares from the guards who believed they knew my story. It wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. The worst part was the sudden clarity that the man I thought was my safe place had always been calculating the weight of my downfall, smiling while he imagined me behind bars. And now I was here, in exactly the place he wanted me, my freedom gone and my name tainted, the first chapter of a nightmare I hadn't agreed to live. That night, as I lay on a thin mattress with my thoughts screaming louder than any prison noise, I realized something chilling. His laugh wasn't just mockery, it was a promise. He wanted me broken. He wanted me erased. And if I didn't find a way to fight, he would get exactly what he wanted. The accusation had shattered my life, but it had also awakened something in me, a cold, steady resolve that would not die, no matter how many walls closed around me. The first night inside was not the worst. It was the second, when the shock had settled and the numbness began to wear off, when the reality of where I was started to carve itself into my skin like frostbite. The walls were the kind of gray that seemed to swallow light, a colorless void that mirrored exactly how I felt inside. They carried a damp chill that seeped into my bones, and no matter how tightly I curled under the thin blanket, I could not shake the cold. The cell had a rhythm of its own, the clang of metal doors at shift changes, the occasional shout that echoed down the corridor, the steady drip of a leaking pipe that punctuated the silence like a cruel metronome. I had thought that being locked away would feel suffocating, but what I hadn't anticipated was how it would feel hollow, how the emptiness of the walls would press against me until I almost believed I had ceased to exist. At first, I kept replaying his words in my head, the ones that had cut deeper than the accusation itself. Enjoy prison, love. The way he said it was not hurried, not careless, but deliberate, as if savoring the taste of my suffering. Each time I recalled that smirk on his face, the same lips that had once whispered vows of forever, the betrayal stung sharper. I had expected anger to rise in me, the kind that could keep me warm in the chill of the cell, but instead, what I felt was a strange, quiet clarity. It was like the cold walls had stripped away every illusion, leaving me with the undeniable truth that the man I thought I loved had never truly loved me back. He had studied me, understood me, and then turned that understanding into a weapon. The officers spoke to me with polite indifference, as though they were reciting lines from a script, convinced already of my guilt. They didn't need to sneer or raise their voices. The simple way they avoided eye contact was enough to tell me they had accepted his version of the story. To them, I was just another woman who had been careless, who thought she was smarter than the system, and finally got caught. Their indifference was almost worse than cruelty, because it made me invisible. I wasn't a person to them, just a case file, a cell number, a date on a docket. And that invisibility, that slow erasure of identity, gnawed at me in the dark. But the more the walls pressed in, the more my mind tried to push back. I started to retrace every step that had led me here. I remembered the bank account statements he insisted on helping me with, the way he always offered to take care of bills, his sudden generosity in paying for things that had once seemed beyond his means. At the time, I thought it was love, a man wanting to share the burdens of life with me. But now, in the cold clarity of the cell, I saw it for what it was. Control. He had been gathering threads, weaving them into a net I never saw tightening around me until it was too late. He had played the long game, preparing documents, planting seeds, ensuring that when the time came, every lie would look like truth and every truth would look like a lie. It was in those hours of silence, broken only by the distant shouts of other inmates, that I realized how utterly alone I was. Friends who might have believed me were silent, unreachable beyond the bars and walls. Family had heard the news in the cruel way it always spreads, through whispers and headlines, and I could imagine their disappointment, their doubt. After all, if the man I was going to marry stood up and accused me, who would question him? He was charming, respectable, careful with his words. I was just the woman who had loved him too blindly. The bitterness settled in slowly, not as fire but as ice. It wasn't rage that kept me awake at night. It was the steady realization that I had been erased from my own life. He had written a story where I was the villain, and now everyone else was reading it as if it were gospel. And yet, beneath that freezing despair, something else stirred. Something small and quiet, but unyielding. A voice that whispered not to accept this, not to let his narrative be the last word. The cold walls pressed in tighter each day, but in their oppressive silence, I began to build something invisible, something he could not touch. A resolve. If he thought the bars would break me, he was wrong. The prison was his victory, yes, but it was also his mistake, because he had underestimated me. He thought my silence meant defeat. He thought the chill of isolation would numb me into surrender, but all it did was make me sharper, colder, more certain that I would find the cracks in his story and tear them wide open. By the end of that second night, as I lay staring at the ceiling with its faint stains and hairline fractures, I understood that survival here would not be about keeping my head down or waiting for mercy. It would be about patience, calculation, and the steady gathering of strength. Just as he had planned my downfall with meticulous care, I would plan my return. The walls were cold, yes, but colder still was the realization that love had been nothing more than a mask he wore while he dismantled me piece by piece. And if he believed that mask would protect him forever, he had already made his first and fatal mistake. Time inside moved strangely, as though the hours were stretched thin like brittle glass, threatening to shatter at the slightest touch. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the opening and closing of steel doors, the shuffle of shoes on concrete, the brief moments of sunlight that seeped through barred windows before vanishing again. I had begun to think I would spend every second of this sentence drowning in silence, surviving only on the bitter taste of betrayal and the cold echo of his laughter in my mind. It was during one of those endless afternoons, when I sat alone at a metal table with my thoughts scraping against each other like rusted blades, that I noticed her. She was sitting a few tables away, eyes fixed on me in a way that made me shift uneasily. Most people looked past me or looked at me with suspicion, but her gaze carried something different. Curiosity, recognition, maybe even defiance. Her name was Marissa, though I didn't learn it until later. At first, I avoided her, as I avoided everyone. I had no interest in conversations that might turn into accusations or in the dangerous alliances that prison was notorious for. But Marissa was persistent. One morning, as the guards handed out breakfast trays, she slid hers across the table toward me with a careless shrug, muttering that she wasn't hungry. It was an unnecessary gesture, small and unremarkable, yet it carried a weight that broke through the walls I had built inside myself. In this place where survival meant clinging to every scrap, she had given me something without expecting anything in return. I didn't trust her immediately. Trust had been the very weapon that destroyed me, sharpened and turned against me by the man I had once called my fiancé. But Marissa didn't demand trust. She simply offered presence. She spoke in fragments at first, stories half finished, memories laced with bitterness. It was during one of these talks that she told me she had once been accused of something she didn't do, that she knew the taste of injustice like a brand seared into her skin. Her case was different from mine, yet the outline was familiar. Someone she trusted had twisted truth into a weapon, and the world had believed it without question. As she spoke, I realized that beneath her hardened exterior was a knowledge I desperately needed, not just of how to survive prison, but how to fight back against the kind of betrayal that left no bruises but destroyed everything nonetheless. Marissa had been inside longer than me, long enough to understand how systems worked, how information moved, how appearances could be manipulated. She explained it all in a tone that was neither sympathetic nor condescending, but matter-of-fact, as if she were teaching me how to breathe underwater. At night, when the lights dimmed and the hallways settled into their uneasy quiet, I replayed her words, threading them into my own thoughts until I began to see a path where before there had been only walls. I still didn't know how to prove my innocence, but for the first time since the cell door had slammed shut, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in the darkness. It was Marissa who asked me the question no one else had asked. What does he gain from this? I had been so consumed by the pain of betrayal that I hadn't dared to pull at that thread. But when she spoke, something clicked. He hadn't just wanted me gone. He had wanted something tangible, something he could hold in his hands once I was locked away. My mind drifted back to the documents, the bank accounts, the subtle way he had insisted on handling details I thought were insignificant. Suddenly, the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was transactional. He had orchestrated this not out of hatred but out of greed, and that realization burned hotter than any anger I had felt before. Marissa's presence became a kind of anchor. We didn't speak constantly, but when we did, her words steadied me, reminded me that I wasn't imagining the threads of deceit. She encouraged me to remember details, to reconstruct conversations, to think like someone who was preparing a case instead of someone drowning in one. She reminded me that stories could be rewritten, that lies could unravel if you pulled at the right seam. Her belief in me wasn't loud or sentimental, but it was steady, and in a place where everything else was fragile, that steadiness became invaluable. I began to notice things I had overlooked before, moments that seemed meaningless at the time but now formed pieces of a puzzle. His sudden eagerness to plan our finances, the way he insisted on taking calls in another room, the strange tension in his smile when he spoke about our future. Each detail sharpened into evidence, not just of his betrayal, but of his intent. And each time I voiced my suspicions to Marissa, she nodded as though confirming a theory she had already considered. She didn't promise me miracles, but she promised me that truth had a way of surfacing if you refused to let it sink. In those weeks, the cold walls of the cell didn't change, but my perspective within them did. I was still a prisoner, still accused, still broken in ways I couldn't fully describe. But I was no longer entirely isolated. I had found an ally in the unlikeliest of places, someone who had nothing to gain by helping me yet chose to anyway. That choice lit a spark in the darkness, a reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, alliances could be formed, strength could be shared, and survival could grow into something more. By the time another month passed, I no longer saw myself only as the woman betrayed and discarded by her fiancé. I began to see myself as someone gathering strength quietly, piece by piece, alongside someone who understood betrayal as intimately as I did. And while I didn't yet know how I would face him, how I would tear apart the lies he had woven, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not face it alone. In Marissa, I had found the ally I didn't expect, and together we would begin the slow work of dismantling the world he thought he had built around me. The first time I let myself truly pull at the thread of why he had done it, why the man who had slipped a ring on my finger and whispered forever had chosen to hand me over to a system eager to believe the worst, it felt like walking barefoot across broken glass. Until then, my focus had been on survival, on getting through the cold nights, on keeping my head above the water of despair, on piecing together enough clarity to remind myself I was still human. But once Marissa had planted that question in my mind, what does he gain from this? It gnawed at me relentlessly. It was no longer just about betrayal. Betrayal was personal, emotional, cruel, but human. This, I began to realize, was something colder, more deliberate, the kind of cruelty born not of heartbreak, but of ambition. I began to sift through memories as though they were evidence boxes in a courtroom. Each detail that had once felt insignificant now took on a sinister weight. I remembered the way he insisted on reviewing my bank statements, claiming it was to ease the burden, to ensure our future together was secure. I remembered how he pushed me to sign documents I didn't fully read, smiling as he reassured me with a soft touch on the hand that he had everything under control. I remembered the strange unease I felt when he asked for my passwords, framed as a gesture of intimacy and trust, and how I convinced myself it was only natural to share everything with the man I was going to marry. And most of all, I remembered the timing, how these gestures intensified in the months leading up to the engagement, how his attentiveness shifted from affection to oversight, as if he were less a lover and more an auditor preparing a file. At first I thought maybe it was money, greed as simple as wanting to drain my accounts, to leave me ruined while he flourished. But the more I thought, the more I realized it was bigger than that. My family had money, old money, the kind that came with inheritance clauses and strict contracts. He knew that by marrying me, by securing his place in the family, he would have access to things that otherwise were closed off to him. But marrying me wasn't enough. He needed me eliminated, discredited, erased. A wife in prison couldn't contest wills, couldn't raise objections, couldn't hold power. By destroying me, he could secure everything under the guise of being the man who had bravely done the right thing in exposing a criminal fiancé. His reputation would rise, my family would close ranks around him, grateful for his loyalty, and he would stand alone in the center of the stage I had once shared with him. It sickened me to realize how long he must have been planning it. Love hadn't been his motivation, it had been his camouflage. Every kiss, every whispered promise, every late-night talk about dreams and futures had been another layer of deception, carefully applied to keep me blind. He had studied me the way a hunter studies prey, learning where I was vulnerable, where I would never think to look. And in doing so, he had found the perfect way to turn my own trust into the knife that cut me down. Marissa listened as I laid it all out, nodding with the detached wisdom of someone who had seen betrayal take many forms. "It's always about power," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the wall as if she were reading secrets written there. "Money, status, control. It doesn't matter the shape it takes. It always comes down to one person wanting to erase another." Her words burned in me because they fit so perfectly. He hadn't just wanted me gone. He had wanted to rewrite the story so that I no longer existed in it, or worse, existed only as a cautionary tale of what happens to liars and thieves. In the nights that followed, my mind became a restless machine, turning over every interaction, every paper, every subtle shift in his tone. I recalled a dinner we had with my parents, how he had guided the conversation toward financial planning and investments, how he had subtly undermined my voice by correcting me on numbers I hadn't even realized he'd memorized. I remembered the way he reassured my mother that he would always protect the family's assets, spoken with the same polished charm that made everyone in the room smile. At the time, I had seen it as him trying to win their approval. Now I saw it as rehearsal, laying the groundwork for the narrative he would eventually spin when he turned me into the villain. The realization was a bitter medicine, but it cleared my vision. It explained the why, and knowing why gave me something stronger than anger. It gave me direction. If greed and power were his motives, then there had to be proof of his trail, something he overlooked in his arrogance, something that didn't align as neatly as he believed. He might have orchestrated my downfall, but in his confidence, he might also have left behind cracks in the story. All I had to do was find them. The walls of the prison still pressed in, the cold still seeped through the mattress at night, but within me, something had shifted. I was no longer only the victim of a man's betrayal. I was an investigator now, piecing together the architecture of his deception, preparing for the moment I could tear it apart. He thought he had buried me alive under lies, but he had underestimated the strength of the woman he had chosen as his scapegoat. In trying to erase me, he had given me something far more dangerous than despair. He had given me purpose. By the end of that week, I was no longer asking myself how I would survive prison. I was asking myself how I would dismantle him, brick by brick, with the same precision he had used against me. The motive was uncovered, and with it came a clarity that chilled me as much as it steadied me. If he had planned this carefully, then I would need to plan even more carefully to undo it. And if he thought his victory was secure, he had already begun to lose. Once I understood the motive, once I accepted that he had orchestrated every piece of this deception to secure not only my silence, but also his rise in the world I had brought him into, the question became not whether I could prove it, but how. Motive alone was not enough to dismantle the careful scaffolding of lies he had built. The courts did not weigh emotion. They weighed facts, and facts were what he had twisted into a noose around my neck. I needed evidence, something solid enough to pierce through the polished mask he wore so well. And yet, the irony was suffocating. The very walls that confined me were the same ones that made it almost impossible to reach for the proof that lay just beyond them. I began with memory, because memory was all I had. I forced myself to comb through every small moment, every careless word he had let slip, every scrap of paper he had placed in front of me with a smile that dared me not to sign. Marissa sat with me during long hours when time felt like it had stopped moving, guiding me as if she were piecing together her own puzzle alongside mine. She told me to treat it like a map, to write down fragments on torn corners of paper we smuggled from the commissary, dates, times, phrases he had repeated. The guards didn't notice. To them it was just the restless scribbling of another inmate trying to pass the hours. But to me, it was the slow reconstruction of my truth, a truth he had tried to erase. There was one night in particular that returned to me with a clarity that felt almost cruel. We had been sitting at his desk, papers spread out under the yellow glow of a lamp, and he had leaned over me with that gentle, coaxing tone he always used when he wanted me to surrender without resistance. He told me it was just routine paperwork, nothing significant, just signatures to streamline the accounts as we prepared for the wedding. He had touched my shoulder, kissed the top of my head, made it all feel so safe that I didn't even read past the first line before signing. In prison, as I lay staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I realized that document might have been the very knife he drove into my back, but memory could only carry me so far. What I needed was proof outside my own mind, traces of him left in the world he thought he controlled. And that was where Marissa surprised me again. She introduced me to someone I never would have spoken to otherwise, a woman who had been inside longer than anyone else I'd met, someone with connections that stretched beyond the walls like invisible threads. Her name was Carla, and though she had an air of bitterness that made her difficult to approach, She had knowledge of how to make things surface, how to draw out records and conversations from places that seemed untouchable. With her guidance, whispers began to reach me. An old co-worker of his who remembered discrepancies in his stories. A banker who had raised questions about unusual transactions before they disappeared into silence. Details small enough to be dismissed by others, but vital to me. The first tangible piece came from a memory I had nearly discarded. He had once left his phone on the table during dinner, and I had noticed an email notification flash across the screen before he snatched it up. At the time, I thought nothing of it, respecting his privacy even when a strange unease pricked at me. Now, months later, the name from that email appeared again in the whispers Carla passed along. A contact tied to financial consultancy, someone with a reputation for greasing the wheels of fraudulent deals. The connection was faint, shadowy, but it was enough to tell me that the web he had spun was not flawless. He had left stains, fingerprints in places he thought no one would ever look. Piece by piece, I began to build a fragile architecture of doubt, notes scribbled and hidden, timelines reconstructed with painful precision. Every time I replayed his laughter in my mind, the words "enjoy prison," "love," dripping like poison, I felt my determination harden. He had thought that by locking me away he had stripped me of all power, but in his arrogance, he had underestimated the strength of what remains when everything else has been taken. Memory, will, and the refusal to die quietly. There were nights when despair clawed at me, when the enormity of the task seemed too heavy, when I wondered if I was chasing shadows that would never solidify into truth. But then I would think of his smirk, of the way my parents had looked at me with horror the day the charges were laid out, of the silence of friends who had once sworn loyalty but now avoided my name. That silence was louder than any cell door slamming shut, and it fueled me. I would not let his lies be the last word written about me. The first time I held a piece of paper in my hands that confirmed what I already knew in my bones, a record of a transaction tied to my account but clearly signed in his hand, I felt something inside me shift. It was like breathing again after being underwater too long. The paper itself was not enough to free me, not yet, but it was proof that he was not untouchable, that his story could unravel if pulled at the right seam. Evidence existed, not only in my memories but in the shadows he had tried to bury. From that moment on, I no longer felt like I was stumbling blind. I was building a case, silently, secretly, brick by brick in the darkness of a place meant to erase me. And though I could not yet see the full picture, I knew that when it came into focus, it would not be me standing on trial in the eyes of the world. It would be him. He had lit the match that burned my life down, but I would gather the ashes carefully, piece them together, and one day soon, I would make him choke on the smoke of his own fire. The paper in my hands was fragile, its edges worn and faintly stained as if it had passed through too many hands before reaching mine. But to me, it was heavier than iron. It was the first undeniable crack in the story he had so carefully written, the first proof that I was not simply screaming into the void. I stared at the handwriting I knew as well as my own, the loops and slants of his signature, the confident strokes he always made when he wanted to appear in control. He had been careless, believing that burying me behind these walls would ensure no one ever connected the dots. But arrogance is its own weakness, and in that arrogance he had left a trail. That slip of paper became the cornerstone, and from it I began to build, slowly, methodically, brick by brick. Marissa encouraged me with a quiet steadiness, reminding me that desperation could be a dangerous companion, that I needed to move with patience instead of fury. She had seen too many people inside act on emotion and lose everything. Her voice grounded me as I began to construct a timeline, piecing together fragments of memory, scraps of rumor, whispers that drifted through the corridors like smoke. Each piece alone was nothing, easily dismissed, easily ignored, but together they began to form a picture, one that pointed away from me and directly toward him. I spent hours sitting on the edge of the metal bunk, pencil in hand, mapping everything on the backs of old commissary receipts, dates of transactions, the names of associates he had mentioned only in passing, moments when his stories had contradicted themselves, but I had been too blinded by love to notice. I recalled the strange tension in his voice whenever I asked about our wedding budget, the way he brushed aside my concerns with jokes, turning my unease into something silly. Now, stripped of affection, those moments stood out like neon signs. He had been grooming not just me, but everyone around us to see me as reckless, careless, even dishonest, so that when the time came, his accusations would feel like the natural conclusion. The hardest part was knowing that outside these walls he was still free, still charming my family, still wearing the mask of the man they thought they knew. He was probably sitting at dinners where my absence was discussed in hushed tones, feigning sadness while carefully reinforcing the story that he was the victim of my lies. That thought haunted me at night, the idea that he might be sitting at my father's table, sipping wine and speaking with that same smile he once reserved for me, now twisting it into false loyalty. But the haunting also hardened me. I refused to be erased so easily. Carla, with her invisible network of connections, became a shadow ally, passing me tidbits of information through methods I didn't dare question. She was blunt and often cruel, reminding me that nothing came without cost, but she also delivered results. A whisper about a safety deposit box, a record of a meeting with a banker who had noticed inconsistencies. Each new fragment was like a brick I added to the wall I was building against him, solid and unyielding. He had built a prison of lies for me, but now I was building something stronger, a fortress of truth that, once complete, would collapse onto him with a weight he could not escape. The process was maddeningly slow. Weeks passed with little more than speculation, false starts, dead ends. There were moments when despair slithered back in, whispering that I was only fooling myself, that even if I gathered 1,000 scraps, they would mean nothing against the polished narrative he had delivered to the world. But then I would return to that paper, to his unmistakable handwriting tying him to the very crimes he had pinned on me, and I would feel the resolve flare inside me again. It was not hope. Not exactly. Hope was too fragile a word. It was certainty, the kind that takes root deep in the bones and refuses to loosen its grip. I learned to mask my intentions, to move with caution even inside. The walls had ears, and not everyone who smiled at you wished you well. I spoke little, listened more, and kept my growing arsenal of evidence hidden in places no one would think to look. I understood now what it meant to live a double life, the woman accused and broken on the surface, and beneath that, the woman calculating every step, preparing for the moment when the roles would reverse. Marissa reminded me again and again that the courtroom would be the stage, that everything I did now was rehearsal for the performance to come. "Don't just survive this," she told me one evening as we sat in the dim glow of the corridor light. "Prepare, because when the time comes, you won't get a second chance." Her words settled over me like armor. I wasn't preparing only to prove myself innocent. I was preparing to expose him, to strip away the mask he had worn so perfectly, and show the world the monster underneath. By the time another season had passed, I no longer thought of myself as the woman he had tried to bury. I was the architect of my own resurrection, building with fragments and shadows, stacking every piece until the weight was undeniable. He had believed his laugh would echo in my ears forever, that his words, "Enjoy prison love," would be my epitaph. But I was already chiseling away at the stone he thought would seal my tomb. Brick by brick, I was building something he could not see yet, but would one day stand before, a structure too solid for him to dismantle, one that would collapse on him with the full force of the truth. And as I stared at the walls of my cell, the same walls that had once felt like my grave, I began to see them differently. They were no longer the end of my story. They were the workshop where I was crafting my return, where the cold silence gave me the focus to sharpen every detail, to prepare every strike. He thought he had won, but I was building. And one day soon, he would learn the difference between silence and surrender. The day of the hearing arrived like the slow roll of thunder before a storm, announced long before it struck, but still jarring when it finally descended. For weeks, I had felt the distant tremor of it, each meeting with my appointed lawyer, each paper slid across the cold surface of a table, each whispered exchange with Marissa and Carla preparing me for the inevitable. But nothing truly prepared me for the moment when the heavy doors of the courtroom opened, and I was led inside, wrists free, but every step still weighted by the shadow of chains. The room smelled of polish and stale air, a sterile theater where the stories of people's lives were rewritten into verdicts. The judge sat elevated, robed in authority, while the spectators' eyes pressed down like invisible shackles. And there, at the far side of the room, sat the man who had once promised me eternity. He was dressed impeccably, his tie the exact shade of calm confidence he always wore when he wanted to charm a crowd. He didn't look at me right away, not directly, but when his eyes finally met mine, his smirk flickered like a cruel memory made flesh. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted me in bold, damning strokes. A manipulative woman who had siphoned funds under the guise of love, who had spun a web of lies so intricate that only the righteous vigilance of her noble fiancé had exposed her. Each sentence was delivered with the cadence of certainty, as though my guilt were already etched in stone. They paraded documents, statements, witnesses rehearsed to believe in his story, all of it designed to cement the image of me as a fraud. And he sat there, hands folded, nodding solemnly, embodying the role of a wounded man still brave enough to stand for truth. For a moment, I felt the weight of it pressing down, the danger of drowning in their narrative. The faces in the gallery shifted uneasily, some sympathetic, some suspicious, many already convinced. My parents were absent, their silence a scar that burned more deeply than any insult. I was alone in the eyes of the court, except I wasn't. Not really. Because beneath the table, I had my own arsenal, the bricks I had gathered one by one, the shadows I had coaxed into evidence. My lawyer glanced at me, uncertain, but I gave a small nod. This was what we had been preparing for. This was the stage Marissa had warned me about, and I would not stumble. When my turn came, the air in the room shifted. My lawyer began to speak, not loudly but steadily, the kind of voice that demands to be listened to without ever needing to shout. He dismantled the prosecution's certainties piece by piece, asking questions that seemed simple, but sliced through their narrative like a knife through fabric. Where had the money gone, if I had taken it? Why were the accounts transferred into shell corporations tied not to me, but to names I had never seen before? Why did the handwriting on certain signatures bear a closer resemblance to my fiancé's than to mine? Each question left a trace of doubt, small but undeniable, and I saw it in the flicker of eyes across the room. The first blow landed when the paper I had clung to in my cell was introduced. His signature, undeniable, placed on a transaction he had sworn under oath I had engineered. The prosecution stammered, tried to pivot, but the seed of contradiction had been planted. I watched him shift in his seat, the slightest tightening of his jaw betraying the first crack in his mask. He tried to meet my eyes with his old confidence, but it faltered, and for the first time, I saw fear slip through the cracks of his performance. Then came the testimonies. Carla's whispers had led us to a banker willing to admit he had been pressured into silence, to a coworker who recalled strange requests, to a paper trail too tangled to be coincidence. Each new piece was another brick stacked against him, another reminder that lies are never flawless, no matter how carefully rehearsed. My lawyer moved with precision, not overwhelming the court, but laying out the pieces like a puzzle, one that slowly revealed a picture very different from the one the prosecution had tried to paint. By the time I was called to speak, my hands were trembling, but not with fear. It was something sharper, colder. I told my story without theatrics, without begging for sympathy. I spoke of trust, of signatures signed under love's blindfold, of the way his betrayal had been dressed in the language of devotion. I let the truth speak for itself, steady and relentless. The room was silent when I finished, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any sound. He tried to recover, of course. He took the stand, his voice dripping with false sincerity, spinning himself as the victim of my cunning. But the cracks were too visible now. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes sharp with suspicion. His rehearsed charm began to falter under the weight of contradiction, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. The man who had once laughed as I was dragged into a cell was now cornered by his own arrogance, trapped not by bars but by the truth he could no longer suppress. As the session drew to a close, no verdict was given yet, but I knew something had shifted. The courtroom no longer saw me as the villain in his story. They saw doubt, and in that doubt, they saw me. He had wanted this stage to be my execution, but instead, it had become his unmasking. I walked out of the courtroom that day, not free, not yet, but carrying something heavier than freedom. Momentum. For the first time since the steel doors had closed behind me, I felt the weight tilt in my favor. And when I glanced back one last time, I saw him staring after me, his smirk gone, replaced by a look he had never shown me before. Panic. It was faint, buried under layers of performance, but I saw it. And in that moment I understood that the war he thought he had already won was only beginning, and this time, the battleground was mine. The days that followed the first hearing stretched like taut strings ready to snap, vibrating with the tension of everything that had been said and everything that had yet to come. Inside my cell, I lay awake through long nights replaying the courtroom in my head, the faces of the jurors, the narrowing of their eyes when contradictions surfaced, the slight stumble in his voice when confronted with the signature he could not deny. Those small fractures in his polished facade were not enough to free me yet, but I knew they mattered. A mask can endure scrutiny only so long before it crumbles, and his was already beginning to slip. Still, doubt gnawed at me. Doubt that somehow he would find a way to twist even this, that his charm would reassert itself, that the world would continue to prefer his lies over my truth. But then came the moment that shifted everything, the moment when shadows transformed into light, and the walls he had built began to collapse under their own weight. It happened in the form of a witness I had not dared to hope for, a name whispered to me by Carla, but one I could hardly believe would ever step forward. Her name was Evelyn, his assistant at the firm where he worked, a woman who had once smiled politely at dinners and blended into the background of conversations. I remembered her vaguely, quiet and efficient, the type of person who was invisible until you realized she had seen everything. When my lawyer announced her presence, I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the first true falter in his composure. Evelyn took the stand with trembling hands, her voice soft but steady. She spoke of late nights in the office, of documents she had been asked to shred, of transactions funneled through accounts that bore my name, but which she had never once seen me handle. She recounted how he dictated emails in my voice, crafted to appear as if I were communicating with bankers and consultants. She admitted her fear, the pressure he had placed on her, the subtle threats that had kept her silent until now. But silence, she said, had grown too heavy, and seeing my name dragged through the mud had become unbearable. She produced files, backups she had kept in secret, digital trails that led not to me but directly to him. The courtroom shifted on its axis in that moment. The jurors leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously. The prosecution tried to object, to dismiss her as unreliable, but the weight of the documents spoke louder than words. The judge allowed them, and in that allowance, the air thickened with something new. Possibility. I watched him then, the man who had once laughed at my downfall, and for the first time, he looked cornered. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched too tightly around the arms of his chair, his composure cracking like thin ice. It wasn't only Evelyn who tipped the scales. Alongside her testimony came the slow accumulation of every brick I had laid, the banker's statement about unusual transfers, the coworker who remembered odd requests, the signature in his hand. Each piece alone had been fragile, but together they formed a structure too strong to ignore. The prosecution's arguments, once confident and sharp, now sounded defensive, scrambling to contain a narrative that no longer held. Their certainty wavered, and in its place grew a silence heavy with reconsideration. As I listened, something shifted inside me too. For months, I had carried the weight of shame, the invisible chains of being branded guilty before I could even speak. But as Evelyn's words cut through the air, that weight began to lift. I sat straighter, not in defiance but in recognition of the truth finally finding its voice. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the turning point. The moment when the current reversed and began to pull him under instead of me. He tried to recover, of course. When it was his turn again, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with indignation, painting Evelyn as a bitter employee, me as a manipulative woman who had coerced others into covering my crimes. But the words rang hollow now, their edges dulled. The jurors no longer looked at me with suspicion but with calculation. measuring the cracks in his story against the steady stream of evidence against him. His charm, once unshakable, now seemed desperate. The performance of a man who knew the stage was slipping from under him. I will never forget the moment when the judge called for a recess and I glanced across the room at him. He met my gaze, but there was no smirk this time. His eyes burned with fury, not triumph, and in them I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Not the fear of losing me, because he had never loved me, but the fear of losing everything he had schemed for, everything he had betrayed me to gain. It was a fear that fed me, steadied me, reminded me that the war was no longer mine to fight alone. The truth had allies now, and its voice was louder than his lies. Back in my cell that night, the walls no longer felt like tombstones pressing in. They felt temporary, fragile, as though the weight that had once pinned me there was dissolving. I knew the fight wasn't finished, that the final blow had yet to land, but the shift was undeniable. I was no longer a prisoner waiting to be condemned. I was a woman standing at the edge of vindication, watching as the man who had tried to bury me began to sink into the pit he had dug. The turning point had come, and from here there was no going back, for him or for me. The verdict did not arrive with the swift finality of a gavel crashing against wood, but with the slow, deliberate weight of a tide pulling everything into its rightful place. I had expected a moment of drama, some explosion of sound to mark the end of the war that had consumed me, but instead, it came in the quiet gravity of words spoken with authority, words that redefined who was guilty and who was free. I remember sitting there, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles were white, as the judge read the decision, each sentence unspooled like a thread pulled from a suffocating knot, unraveling the story he had woven around me. Guilty? Not me, but him. Guilty of perjury, of fraud, of malicious intent, of crimes carefully plotted and executed under the disguise of devotion. The gavel did strike then, but it was not an execution. It was liberation. The air in the courtroom shifted in an instant. I felt it before I could even believe it. Whispers rippled through the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, and the jurors sat with the calm finality of people who had done their duty. I didn't cry. Not then. I had thought I would. That tears would come pouring out as a flood to release all the months of silence and suffocation. But instead, I sat frozen in a strange stillness, absorbing the reality that for the first time since that awful morning when handcuffs closed around my wrists, the world no longer saw me as a villain. The weight that had crushed me was gone, and in its place was something terrifyingly light. Freedom. I looked at him then, the man who had once whispered forever, and later laughed as I was dragged away. His mask was shattered beyond repair. The charm he had worn so effortlessly, the smirk that had haunted my sleepless nights, were gone. He stood there pale, eyes darting desperately as though searching for an exit that no longer existed. The same mouth that had told me to enjoy prison love now trembled with words he could not form, trapped in the realization that he was the one facing the bars. His fall was not loud. It was pitiful. The collapse of a man stripped of his illusions, laid bare before the world he had once convinced of his superiority. As officers moved toward him, I experienced a strange mixture of emotions I could not name. There was no joy, not the kind I had imagined in my darkest hours when I dreamed of seeing him suffer. There was no triumphant cry, no sense of vengeance satisfied in flames. What I felt was colder, sharper. It was justice, pure and unadorned, the clean edge of truth slicing through months of lies. And beneath that, justice was relief, the kind that settles deep into the bones and makes you feel human again. Walking out of the courtroom that day was like stepping into a world I no longer recognized. The sky seemed wider, the air clearer, but everything was tinged with the surreal awareness that I was walking free, only because of a battle I had been forced to fight. Cameras flashed, voices called my name, questions swirled around me like smoke, but I didn't stop to answer. I wasn't ready to narrate my pain for the curious. Freedom was too fragile, too sacred, to be cheapened by sound bites. I walked past them, past the chaos, and let the sun touch my skin like it was the first time in years. The first true breath I took outside was both painful and beautiful. Painful, because I felt the echo of months spent inside, of nights staring at walls that refused to bend. Beautiful, because I knew those nights were behind me. Yet even as I breathed, I understood that freedom was not as simple as walking away. Freedom now carried scars. It carried the memory of betrayal carved into my soul, the knowledge that the man I had trusted most had tried to annihilate me. I would carry that forever, but I would carry it standing, not broken. They led him away in chains, and I watched without flinching. His eyes found mine one last time, but this time there was no smirk, no laugh, no power, only emptiness. And in that emptiness, I found my final release. He could no longer touch me. He could no longer write my story. He had fallen, and in his fall I was free. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of paperwork. Apologies from those who had doubted me. Attempts by my family to mend the silence that had nearly destroyed me. I accepted some words, ignored others. I didn't need their validation anymore. Freedom was not something they could give me. It was something I had carved out with my own hands, with patience, with pain, with an unrelenting refusal to disappear. At night, when I lay in my own bed again, the sheets soft and unfamiliar after months of rough fabric and metal frames, I would think of the cold walls of the cell. I thought of how those walls had tried to convince me I was powerless, and how in their silence I had built the strength to fight. I thought of his laughter, how it once echoed in my mind like a curse, and how now it meant nothing more than the sound of his arrogance sealing his fate. I thought of freedom, not as a gift, but as a victory. His fall was not just his alone. It was the collapse of the cage he had built around me. And as I stepped out into the world again, I knew with unshakable certainty that while prison had taken my time, my dignity, my peace, it had not taken me. I had taken myself back. His fall was complete, and in its shadow, my freedom was finally real. Freedom was not an explosion, not a sudden blaze that burned away the darkness. It came like dawn creeping in after the longest night, a slow wash of light over a landscape I no longer recognized. The world outside had moved on without me, reshaping itself in my absence, yet every corner I turned carried the faint shadow of what had happened. I had walked out of the courthouse a free woman, my name cleared, his fate sealed, but liberation was not as simple as stepping past the threshold of stone and steel. Freedom was a rebuilding, a relearning of how to exist without the constant weight of suspicion pressing down on my shoulders, without the cold echo of his voice haunting me. The first days were the hardest, not because of the chaos of reporters or the polite apologies from people who had abandoned me, but because of silence. Silence in my own home, silence in my own bed. After months of confinement, where every sound carried meaning, the quiet of my apartment felt almost unbearable. The space was filled with his absence, yet he lingered like a ghost in the objects he had once touched, in the papers he had insisted I sign, in the ring I had long since taken off, but which still left a pale circle on my skin. I walked from room to room like a stranger in my own life, wondering if I would ever reclaim it, or if I had to burn it all down and start from ashes. But life has a way of seeping back in, even when you think it has deserted you. Marissa wrote me letters after I left, words scratched in careful handwriting that reminded me I was not alone, that strength could be shared even across walls. Carla's network dissolved back into shadows, but I knew she had played her part in ensuring the truth surfaced. I owed them pieces of my freedom, and though I could never repay them fully, I carried their names like talismans against forgetting. In their ways, they had shown me what loyalty really was. Loyalty forged not in love or blood, but in shared survival. I began to rebuild slowly. Each morning I woke up and forced myself to move, to open windows, to breathe air not filtered through bars. I returned to small routines, brewing coffee, walking to the market, writing lists that reminded me I was still capable of shaping days. Strangers looked at me differently now, not with suspicion but with curiosity, some with pity, some with awe. I learned to ignore their stares, to carry myself not as the woman who had been betrayed and broken, but as the woman who had endured and risen. My reflection in the mirror looked different, sharper around the edges, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. Prison had aged me, but it had also carved me into something harder, something no betrayal could ever shatter again. As for him, his name became nothing more than a headline. sentenced, disgraced, forgotten. He lived now behind the very walls where he had tried to bury me, stripped of his suits, his charm, his illusions. I didn't follow his story closely. I didn't need to. Knowing that his laughter no longer echoed in freedom, but was swallowed by the same silence he had condemned me to, was enough. He had wanted to erase me, but instead he had erased himself. His fall was complete, and with it, the last tether between us was cut. There were moments, of course, when anger surged, when I wanted to scream at the injustice of having lost so much time, so much trust, to a man who had only ever seen me as a pawn. But those moments grew shorter as the weeks passed. I learned that healing was not about erasing pain, but about folding it into yourself, letting it become part of the architecture that holds you upright. My scars were invisible, but they were strong, reminders that I had survived the worst, and could survive anything. I stopped wearing the pale circle where the ring had once been like a wound. One day I bought myself a new ring, a simple band of silver I slipped onto a different finger. It wasn't a promise to anyone else. It was a promise to myself, a vow that I would never again allow love to blind me, never again let trust be twisted into a weapon. It was not a symbol of bitterness, but of resolve, of ownership of my own life. When Christmas came, I decorated a tree alone for the first time in years. As I placed the lights and ornaments, I realized I wasn't lonely. There was peace in that solitude, a peace I had once feared but now embraced. The cold walls that had once threatened to erase me had become the forge that reshaped me. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into prison, trembling and betrayed. I was someone harder, steadier, someone who understood that freedom is not given. It is fought for, brick by brick, shadow by shadow, until it stands unshakable. Looking back now, I see the arc clearly. He thought his laughter would be my undoing, that his lies would be the end of my story. But they were only the beginning. My fiancé had falsely accused me, tried to lock me away forever, mocked me with his parting words. Yet here I am, free, standing, writing the epilogue of my own life while he rots in the cage he built for himself. His fall was spectacular, but my freedom was quieter, steadier, more enduring. And in that quiet, I found something better than vengeance. I found myself.